Very good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for coming for this lecture on our global entrepreneurship. This is going to be our last lecture actually for the semester. And last week I had a session with the students, and you told me that one of the most interesting and enjoyable part of the course was the external speakers that we got. So we opted to end the course with an external speaker. So today with us is Carl Joffers. He's the CEO at Tandemic Fund, a venture fund that invests in social enterprise, and also a director at Tandemic, the consulting arm of Tandemic Fund that specializes in building communities and social movement for brands and also for non-profits. Previously, he was a partner with Wired Palm, an innovation strategy consultancy, and also he worked with Khazanah, the Malaysian body that manages the Wealth Fund, and he's also a founder and president of Silitex, a Montreal-based software development company serving clients in the higher education sector. So today, Carl is going to talk to us about getting your lean startup on. So please join me in welcoming Carl.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to use a microphone because...
The microphone's on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, fantastic. I can't hear myself. You're going to have to bear with me a little bit because I'm just coming off of a bad cold. So I'm going to be hanging on to this water bottle throughout the presentation. So what I want to talk to you guys a little bit about today is about how to accelerate the pace from which you come up with an idea to you actually finding out whether there's a business in that idea and building a business out of it. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the startup process, and that's something that we're really closely involved in. We're continuously at Tandemic building new startups. Some of them succeed, some of them don't, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I want to start with a first question to you guys. What is a startup for you guys?
Starting up a new thing, activity, or something like that.
All right, so it's not necessarily a business. A startup could be starting a new project.
Yeah, maybe.
All right. Cool.
The capital required to start the project, capital.
Right, so it's like the money that you need to actually start a project, or probably a company, right?
That's right.
Okay. And one last one right over here.
An idea?
It's an idea.
The idea is a startup.
An idea is a startup. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so for the purpose of this presentation, and I think this is actually a really good way of thinking about a startup, I'm looking at it as an organization that's formed to find a repeatable and scalable business model. Now, I just want to settle on that definition for a little bit. So the first part is it's a temporary organization. So I'm talking about right now startup companies, right? So someone goes out and what was Facebook in 2006, right? Or what was Google in 2002 or whenever it was started, right? It was a temporary organization set up looking for a repeatable and scalable business model. So what do we mean by that? So repeatable means that I can go out and I can do this over and over again. So let's say I start up a company and I am selling to you candy, right? Now, if I sell candy once, that is not a repeatable business model, right? I need to be, for me to have a real company at the end of the day, I need to be able to sell candy over and over and over again, right? And then scalable is I need to be able to do it on a very, very large scale. So I want to be able to sell candy to lots and lots of people. So a startup is just a bunch of people who've actually come together and they're trying to find this repeatable and scalable business model. right? And what Facebook is today is the repeatable and scalable business model. They're no longer the temporary organization, right? Facebook is now a very permanent, steady organization that has found a way to generate money on a very large scale. And so I want to just dive into this next question, which is, well, what's a business model, right? And these are, I have to say, these are actually two really kind of tough questions. Because if you go to the business school and you ask people, go ask the students, what's a business model? You know, they're going to have trouble answering that question too, because it turns out that a lot of people haven't really, you know, necessarily come to a strong conclusion about what a business model is. Do you guys want to try a stab at what is a business model? We have one person. Great.
Maybe it's a foundation where you build your business upon.
Okay. Do you want to tell me anything more about that foundation?
Maybe it's what makes your business different from similar business.
Okay. Okay.
Or maybe it's a series of steps or habits on what you already have an idea of, where you start to develop and you are testing it out. Whether it's this series of things, can it be feasible in business?
So it's kind of like, what does your company actually do? Yeah. Okay. I think that's actually quite good. I'm going to say business model is actually something really simple. It's a very simple idea. It's how you create and deliver value for your customer, right? And how you make money from it. So on one side, there's a simple transaction, right? If I'm going to sell you candy, I need to create that candy for you. And if I'm going to have a business, I need to collect money in order to, you know, sell you that candy. So that's just simply what a business model is. So if we go back to this definition, right? A startup is not a small version of a big company. A startup, because this idea, a big company is a permanent organization. A startup is actually something that is searching for, it's a search process for this repeatable and scalable business model. And as a startup, and when you create a startup, the way that you want to think about it is not like I'm forming this corporation and, you know, we're going to have a CEO and managers and all of these different people and we're going to go for this market and this market. It's all set in stone. Let's execute now. The way you want to think about a startup is you want to say, you know what? We don't really know whether people want our product or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend time searching for this repeatable and scalable business model. And the whole game, the whole sort of startup idea and the whole startup ecosystem is basically a game. And the game is you have to find the scalable and repeatable business model before you run out of money, right? So, you know, maybe an investor is going to come in and they're going to say, hey, Cal, you know, I'll give you $100,000 to sell candy to people. So, you know, go out and sell candy and make some money for me, right? And so my job is to find out what are the customer segments, what kind of candy do I need to sell, what is my scalable and repeatable business model before I run out of that $100,000. Because when I run out of that $100,000, what happens is a startup failure. So today, I'm going to talk about how to play that game. But I'm actually first going to talk about how to not play that game from an example of some of our own work. So one of the things that we run at Tandemic is this thing called Hati. And I don't know, have any of you guys heard of this? Couple, 1, 2 people. So Hati is Malaysia's largest open database or directory of NGOs. So we have profiles of NGOs, and believe it or not, NGO information is unbelievably hard to find in Malaysia. And so this is actually something, every month 17,000 Malaysians go to Hati looking for organizations to donate to, looking for NGOs, you know, does this NGO really exist? They all go to this website. And at one point we started getting a few years ago, we started getting a lot of requests for volunteering activities. So a lot of people said, hey, I want to volunteer, but I don't know where to start. Because it turns out that if you don't have an auntie or an uncle involved in an NGO or a friend, you don't know about their volunteering activities, right? And there was just no place to go to actually find it. So all these people who wanted to go out and volunteer that we were hearing from, and they couldn't because they just couldn't find the opportunities. So my team and I said, well, we should go out and try to fix this problem. what we did is we came up with this idea to create something called Do Something Good. And Do Something Good would be a platform, an online platform where NGOs would go and they would post up their volunteering opportunities, and then sort of volunteers could go in and then they could find volunteering opportunities that match their interests. They would get points and badges for actually volunteering and taking part in volunteering activities. So when we did this, we talked to a couple of people. We talked to a couple of people in the industry and we said, hey, what do you guys think? Because we share our ideas, right? So we never thought that someone would be like, oh, this is a great idea, we're going to steal it. Because the truth is, excuse me, and I'm sure you've heard this from a couple of other speakers before, it's not the idea that matters, it's the execution, right? So share your idea as much as possible, just make sure you out-execute everyone who is actually going to be working on it. So we went on, we talked to a bunch of people about this idea, and what do you guys think they said? I don't know. If I came up, if Do Something Good didn't exist today and I came up to you and I said, hey, we're going to create an online platform for NGOs to connect to volunteers. What's that? Cool idea, okay. Right? Some people did say that. A lot of people said, don't do something good. So a lot of people were like, oh, this will never work. You know, Malaysians will never volunteer. Why? What's in it for them? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Good thing we didn't listen to them. We went ahead and we did it anyway. And so we built the site. We built the site, but then something, and actually this was like a lot of my summer vacation in France, and a lot of other people's time as well, was spent on actually building the first version of the site. And we thought we understood the problem, but it turns out that the site that we built wasn't exactly what the volunteering space needed. Right? So we thought we understood the problem, we thought we knew what the solution was, and then we built it, and then we realized that wasn't the case. Now this is what we thought. We thought that recruiting volunteers would be tough, especially because everyone was like, oh, people won't volunteer in this country, so on and so forth. It turns out the reality is that volunteers enthusiastically accepted the platform. We had more volunteers than we needed in many cases. Now, we thought that NGOs would enthusiastically embrace the platforms. NGOs would be like, cool, this is more manpower. We're going to, we're going to be able to get more volunteers to work on our stuff. Makes sense. Turns out that they were the most difficult to get onto that platform, actually. So a lot of NGOs were very old school. They were kind of like, well, you know, working with volunteers is actually really tough because we have to train them each time, and then, especially when we're dealing with university students, they will come in and then they'll screw off, and then we won't see them ever again. So we're not sure that it's really worth our time. And so it actually turned out that the real problem that we needed to solve was not thinking about how do we get volunteers in, but was thinking about how do we help NGOs actually manage them. And then we also thought that most people, obviously not everyone who signed up for a volunteering opportunity, but most people who did sign up for volunteering opportunities would actually show up. Now, you guys have all joined Facebook events, right? And have not joined them actually. So this whole Facebook event thing turns out has changed a lot in terms of people's behavior. A lot of people now RSVP for events without any plans on turning up. Which is bad, and so we understood that, right? Because we're in the same age group and we're using Facebook, but the NGOs don't understand that, and they're so depressed. They're like, 20 volunteers signed up and only 11 showed up, and for them that was a dramatic failure, right? And so there's also this generational gap. And so we discovered that there were a lot of, in a sense, we built the wrong product, right? Because, well, I'll get to it in a second, but in a sense, we built the wrong product because we had thought that we were trying to build something to serve volunteers when, in fact, we needed to build something to serve the NGOs. So it turns out in Malaysia, we later did a study on the state of volunteering in Malaysia, and it turns out in Malaysia, we have about 135,000 registered volunteers. 40,000 of them are active. This is in 2012. And so you could say, well, that's not a lot, but the truth is that we actually would put out, say, a volunteering opportunity for a designer, and like 7 designers would sign up, right? And we didn't need 7 designers. We only needed 1. And so the truth was, actually, it's not about, you know, having tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of volunteers. It was just making sure that we actually had a couple of volunteers that would help the different organizations that were on the platform in a committed way. And that was enough to make the volunteering movement happen. The real issue was that more than 40% of the organizations and NGOs that we have in the Hati directory in Malaysia don't have any kind of online presence, right? And we had some organizations that we were excuse me, trying to sign up into Do Something Good that were like, oh, we don't have email, can you fax us? And we're like, fax? Where do you get that? So it still exists, I'm sure, in this universe. I have a fax machine in the office. Yeah, we had to like literally like fax them or like go to their office and tell them, here's a list of your volunteers that have signed up online. So this was the real issue, and so that the online thing, and then out of the 8,000 registered societies in Malaysia, only about 300 of them were actually recruiting volunteers. We didn't know this when we started, and so there are a lot of different gaps in volunteering. So yeah, a few organizations recruiting, a lot of organizations are having trouble managing volunteers, and you know, there's this whole idea of the modern volunteer. So like some people are like, yeah, I'll totally volunteer by like posting stuff up on my Facebook for you. And then there are people who are like, yeah, I'll totally volunteer by showing up one afternoon on Saturday. And then there are people who are like, I will volunteer for 6 months and show up every Saturday. And these are different levels of engagement. And if you think about it as a sales funnel, the top one is very wide. A lot of people will do it. The bottom one is very narrow. Very few people will do it. And so this was a mistake that we had made when we built Do Something Good. And the result was actually we lost a lot of time. We also lost a lot of money on it because if we had known that that was the problem early on, then we could have actually designed the platform that way from the start. And so I want to ask you guys this. From this story that I just told you about going in the wrong direction, what is your takeaway? If you were to start a startup today or next month, no, next week. If you were to start up a startup next week, what would be your lesson that you would take away from this?
Perform a market survey first.
Perform a market survey, all right.
Yeah. Perform a market survey before actually trying something.
Cool.
Or don't do something good.
Cool.
Don't do something.
That will be show up in a very interesting way in the video because I will have repeated your question before you said it to me. Anything else? I think this is generally a good point. But I think that's what the business textbooks will tell you. They will tell you, go do research, go understand your market, blah, 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 right? And the truth is, we were already in the social sector, right? We ran the largest open database of NGOs. Like, this is something, if we had, like, there weren't that many people probably who I think could have done research for us that would have exceeded what we already knew about the space, right? And for me, the biggest takeaway, okay, this is a little bit about, the biggest takeaway is this, actually. Even if you know your sector really well, even if you're like an expert in the space, chances are your first idea probably won't be your best one. And it might not be your last one. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But here's a little bit about what we decided to do afterwards. So, I mean, Do Something Good is not a dead platform. It continues and is live and well today. And so we have a super volunteer program. And so what super volunteers do is they help NGOs organize volunteering activities on their behalf. So they manage other volunteers, and so we've been sort of training up people to do that, and that's worked really well. And we've run a whole series of other experiments around, say, changing the workflow for registering volunteers and for doing volunteering events, so that so that we can improve conversion rates and so that we can get more participation. And so today we have 60,000 volunteers registered and 300 organizations using it. So even if you think you know your space really well, this will probably be the case. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So does anyone know what PayPal was before it was PayPal? Besides being a really annoying payment transaction platform, as some of you guys are now seeing. Oops, sorry. Opinions do not reflect the institution or the course, and personal only. But yeah, does anyone know? No. So it turns out PayPal was this thing, this idea that these guys had, and you could only really come up with in Silicon Valley, in the days of personal digital assistants. And so PDAs were like iPhones, except without the phone. And you would put notes in them, and it would have a calendar and stuff like that. And the idea was, if we went to the restaurant together, and you paid for the bill, I could take my PDA out, and I could, through the infrared port, I could beam you some money. And that was what PayPal was. And so they built an app around that. And thankfully, it wasn't very long before they realized that was actually a pretty terrible idea, that no one really cared. So they did it. They did a demo. There's some excitement. And then people were like, this is really weird. And then no one used it. And so they realized pretty quickly on that, actually, this is not a great idea. And so they changed. And what they did is they decided to use one of their core assets at PayPal was their encryption technology, their security layer. And so they decided to use that, and they did what we call a pivot. And they said, OK, we're going to take this piece of technology, and we're going to go for a different market. We're going to go for online transactions. And they did it before they ran out of money, which is how they managed to sell for, I think, $2.6 billion to eBay. So there's PayPal. Does anyone know what YouTube was before they became what they are today? They were a video dating website. Yeah. Where would they be today if they were still a video dating website? I don't know. Instagram. Anyone knows about the predecessor to Instagram? So these guys, so this is an illustration also, like, here we are on the opposite side of the news, right, and of Silicon Valley. And so we hear about these guys who were successful, and like 13 people, they sold their company for how much? 1.4 billion. And it's like a tiny company. It took them 18 months or something crazy like that. So we hear the opposite side of the success story. But in Silicon Valley, people will say it takes 7 years to become an overnight success. Which means that you don't see all of the other failures that were accumulated before they got to this point, right? So Instagram, these guys started something called Bourbon first, and the idea behind Bourbon was I could go to like bars and stuff, and like I would check in and I would take a photo and I post it up into this social network. It was actually a lot like Foursquare. And it was really slow, and people didn't really like it. It didn't take off. So they said, you know what? We're going to strip everything out except for the photo part, because people seem to really like the photo part. And they did it, and it took off. It took off really, really well. Excuse me. And it also helps that it solved a problem that a lot of people had at the time, which was that cell phone photos looked really crappy. And then LinkedIn. LinkedIn, is today what it kind of is, basically today what it was before. But one of the important things is that a lot of people don't know is that actually LinkedIn launched without some really important features and didn't add them for a very, very long time. So search, for example, is not a feature that was in LinkedIn for quite a while. They were thinking about delaying the launch of LinkedIn for a few weeks, and like, oh, well, we could build a search feature in. And they were like, you know what, let's just launch it and go ahead. And it turns out that people didn't really need it or use it or want it or ask for it. And so that was really interesting. And if you think about it, actually, and I was just using the LinkedIn app last night, all I do is just like browse and like accept stuff, and like, I actually don't use search very much. Or if I do, it's from like Google search. So all of these guys had completely different ideas when they started out. And they managed to actually make the switch over to from a terrible idea to a good one, or at least a good one, we mean the scalable and repeatable business model, right? So like PayPal has figured out what is their scalable and repeatable business model. So they're no longer a temporary organization. YouTube, same thing, so on and so forth. And so what this means is that as you start your own projects you want to fail fast so that you can succeed sooner. Because you know, or you're pretty sure that your first idea won't be the best one. So what this means is that you don't want to try to launch the perfect product from the start. You want to launch a limited one. You want to launch something that is not necessarily perfect, but you want to get it into people's hands, and you want to see whether people actually use it and whether it delivers value to them, and whether they think it's useful, and see what they want improved, rather than just sort of sit in a room and say, these are the features that I think people want. So that you don't run out of money. And you want to do this so that you don't run out of money before you find that scalable and repeatable business model. So how do you do that? Here are a couple, well, I'll talk a little bit about that. So this is your typical development process, let's say, for a technology startup. So, you know, you go from the idea, you build something, you're going to code it or you manufacture it, you measure, you know, whether people like it, what are the different things that people like in it, you get some data out of it, you learn, you have ideas, and you go through this cycle. Now, for a new product, if you're building an app or if you're building a web app or something like that, this cycle can easily take 6 months to a year, right? And what your challenge is, and 6 months to a year, by the way, is a lot of time, right? And you could spend 6 months to a year working on something that no one in the world cares about, right? And like, what a waste of your own life that would be. It would be sad, right? So like, let's make sure that it's short. How do you do that? You want to, as much as possible, skip this coding part. And this is something that a lot of software engineers in the tech sector have trouble with, but you know, probably other kinds of engineers too, because it's like, okay, I've been trained to build stuff, right? So like, I'm going to go and I have this product idea and I'm going to go and build it, right? And then we're going to try to market it. And you're going to spend that 6 months to a year. What you want to do is you want to skip it and you want to be able to go straight into measuring whether people want it. So what this has to do with, in part, is creating evidence-based startups. And that's kind of, I started off this presentation talking about, or it's titled Lean Startup. And Lean Startup is an evidence-based startup approach. I'm going to tell you a little story about evidence-based stuff. So evidence-based medicine is actually kind of new, and which is a scary thought, actually. I'm really glad that I'm born in this age, because it turns out that bloodletting was routine until 1836, until the French physician Pierre Louis ran the first clinical trials. Oh my God, it took us until 1836 to figure out that we needed to run clinical trials before figuring out what are the best ways of saving people. Are you guys familiar with what bloodletting is? So it's just draining blood from someone. Like, literally, people thought that it made sense to drain blood from people who were sick. And that was how you would heal them, because there were these bad humors in their blood, and you know, by draining the blood, you'd get rid of these humors, and then they'd regenerate new and healthy blood. So that was the idea. And then in 1836, sort of Pierre Louis came in. He did the first clinical trials with pneumonia patients, actually. And so he treated some of his pneumonia patients with aggressive bloodletting, and he treated another group without it. And he found that the patients that he treated with aggressive bloodletting actually died more often. For us, not surprising at all. For the medical community back then, whoa, this doesn't make any sense, right? But a lot of people, unfortunately, had to die. And one of those people is actually George Washington, the first president of the United States. So George Washington was being treated for, I kid you not, a sore throat. And doctors drained 5 pints of blood from him to treat his sore throat, and he died 2 days later. Sounds completely stupid, but that was the world before evidence-based medicine, if you will. And unfortunately, this is how a lot of startups are being built now, right? So, actual gravestone. So unfortunately, it's because what's happening is it's a bunch of people in a room that are saying, yeah, this is a really great idea about what our customers want. I'm sure this is what they want. And then they're going out and they're building it. And it turns out that that is not evidence-based at all. And that is the equivalent of doctors saying, yeah, bloodletting is a really good idea. Well, maybe you should try it out first, right? And find out. And so what this means in terms of your role as someone who's working in a startup or who's building a startup is that you have these two kinds of things that you have to do, right? You have to be a salesman, so you have to get out of that room where you're brainstorming and you're thinking about all of your ideas and start talking to people. And then you also have to be the scientist because you're running experiments to figure out what it is that actually people want. So the kinds of experiments or the thing that you're experimenting on is what we call the customer problem solution hypothesis. So this is basically it's my hypothesis is that this is my customer and that this is my problem, this is my solution, right? So my hypothesis is that my customer is Taylor's university students. The problem is that they are really tired at the end of the day, and my solution is to sell them candy, you know, something like that, right? So this is what you're testing on, basically. As you're building your startup, you're running through a continuous cycle of testing on this. Now, why am I displaying a photo of puppies? Because I want to tell you about a story of, just to run you through an example of a startup that did this. So there was a startup in New York called Puppy Match. And the idea behind Puppy Match was that dog owners would want to date each other because they have similar interests, right? And then they would also want their dogs to breed with each other. So this is what happens when people sit in a room and come up with ideas, okay? So like, obviously to us, we're like, what's wrong with these people? But you know what the truth is, and this is something I have learned also from mentoring startups, is you can't tell people their idea is stupid, right? They'll never believe you. You have to send them and talk, they have to go and talk to people to find it out for themselves. But anyway, they thought it was a great idea. So they practiced the lean startup approach, and they went to Central Park in New York, and they asked 50 dog owners whether or not they would be interested in signing up for their service, where they are doing this, you know, matching. And so out of those 50, only 7 said yes, and 6 of them were guys. So obviously there are some problems here. But one of the things that they did find out while they were talking to all of those people was that that those people were actually very interested in signing up their dogs for play dates, right? So like their dogs would come together and they would play with each other. And so the next day they went out to a different park and they asked 30 dog owners whether they'd be interested in signing up their dogs for play dates the next day, right? And so someone earlier said, you know, talked about market research. This is different from market research because market researcher would go up to, you know, 30 dog owners and they'd say, would you be interested in signing up your dogs for play dates? And the person said, yeah, maybe, yeah. These guys went out and they said, would you be interested in signing up your dog for a play date tomorrow? Which is a committal question. Is like, are you actually interested, or are you just telling me yes so that you will, you know, go away and and leave me alone? And out of those 30 people, 22 said yes. 21 of them gave email addresses. So they knew that they were onto something. And then the business model part and where does the money come in, they went to a dog pet shop, basically, a luxury pet shop, and they got them to sponsor a play date. And so what happened there is that these guys could actually have said, hey, we have a great idea. Let's go build a website for our dating platform and get some investors, spend a bunch of money, you know, advertising it and doing stuff like that. And then 6 months, 8 months later, find out that actually this is a really terrible idea. But they didn't. They did it over a weekend. They figured out what was wrong about their idea, and they figured out what was a good way of going about it. And I think that's tremendously valuable. And so one thing, and one big takeaway is obviously that you guys have to get out of the building. And I think a lot of people and a lot of entrepreneurs, I think you guys need to be honest with yourselves, find this a little bit scary. going and talking to strangers and potential customers. But the truth is that actually people are really, like, they will share their opinions with you, no problem. We just did a Lean Startup weekend where people did things like what Puppy Match did here in KL, and you will have no idea, like, people who went out and talked to customers, not only did they come back with contact information, some of them came back with real cash. Like, they went up and they managed to sell stuff to people out on the street, right? And as long as you don't look like you're a sketchy sort of insurance salesperson or like MLM or whatever, like, people will listen to you, or they'll answer your questions anyway. They'll be like, hey, I just wanted to find out a little bit more about, like, you know, how do you charge your phone and stuff like that. And like people answer that, and it's tremendously valuable information. So I'm going to talk about setting up how to do this validation process, right? And how you would actually, like, go about it on a day-to-day basis. So what you want to start with is, so I talked about customer problem solution hypothesis. What you're going to start off with is you're just going to look for your customer and your problem hypothesis, and you just want to explore that, right? So, like, are people actually facing, before going into the solution, are people actually facing the problem that I'm talking about? And so this is the beginning of, this is like one column in your validation board. So you would set up a board, and it would have, like, as you do your startup, you would have your tests, and you'd have them set one after the other, right? And so you're going to identify a customer, you're going to identify a problem, and then you're going to identify some core assumptions behind it. And your customer, by the way, is not like some demographic group like you know, Malaysians between 18 and 26, right? Your customer is a group of people that have some kind of problem in common. So it's like university students who run out of battery power on their mobile phone, on their smartphones, right? In Klang Valley. So something like that. You know, you want to be really specific, not vague about who your customer set is. And the reason is that you actually want to invalidate, you want to get to a point where you can know whether you've invalidated this sort of pair, right? So if you run experiments, that generate inconclusive results, as you guys know, you won't learn anything, right? But if you've gone for a super focused segment and then you got a no answer, at least you know that it's not that segment you're going after. And then you can go for another customer segment. And when you hit that super focused segment that says yes, then you're like, awesome, I have a really clear picture about who my customers are, and I know exactly how to target my marketing, which will allow me, and as a startup, you need to be very efficient with how you do your marketing because you don't have crap loads of money. So the customer, and then some core assumptions. So I'll give you, core assumptions are basically like an assumption without which, if it was false, basically, your whole thing falls apart, right? It doesn't work. And so what you'll do is you'll set these guys out and say, what's my riskiest core assumption? And you'll test that one. And if that test turns out okay, then you'll test your next riskiest core assumption, so on and so forth. So, and finally, of course, you have to decide on some kind of weakest outcome that you'll accept, right? So a little bit, this is what makes it a little bit different from, say, I guess the scientific method is, in the scientific method you can disprove things, no problem. You can't prove anything except, you know, mathematical or logical statements. But in this case, we have to make a decision what we're going to accept as validated, right? And so if you say, you know, 10 out of 20 people tell me that they have this problem, I'm going to consider that validated, and I'm happy with that to go on for my startup, then that's great. And then you can move on to your next sort of, either core assumption or your next customer problem pair. So let me give you an example so that you can picture this a little bit better. So this is Trevor Owens, guy based in New York, talks a lot about Lean Startup. He wanted to see whether he could sell Vespas in New York and whether there was a market for it. And so he started by looking at, so Vespa is a solution already, but this is a customer set and this is a problem, so he's not going to talk about the solution yet. So his customer, well, he wants to understand why are people buying Vespas, so customers group is Vespa buyers. And he he thinks that the problem that Vespa buyers are trying to solve is that they think oil is bad, right? So a couple of core assumptions are obviously that they care about the environment, that they need a ride to get around New York because maybe they're living outside of the public transit space or whatever, and that price really matters. So which one do you think is the riskiest core assumption here? Yeah, the most likely to be like false maybe. That they care about the environment? Sure. So that is exactly what he thought was the riskiest core assumption there, and that was what he was going to test. And so his test was actually quite ingenious. So what he did is he said, I'm going to put up an ad for Vespas on Craigslist, and this ad will have a picture of a real-looking Vespa that I don't actually own, and I'm going to sell it at a relatively cheap price because I want people to call me up and to talk to me about buying, potential buyers to call me up and talk to me. And his success criterion was that at least 1 out of 20 of the people who called him up would mention that the environment is what they care about when they're buying a Vespa, right? That's actually a pretty brilliant way of doing a bit of market research there, right? And what you'll see is that a lot of the people who practice these methods actually come up with very inventive ways of running experiments on whether their core assumptions are true or not. And so different people started calling him, and he started talking to them, and people would say, hey, why are you buying a Vespa? Oh, well, my girlfriend has one and I feel left out. Or another person was like, oh, well, I just want to wear a skinny tie in a Vespa. And what happened was not a single person said that they actually cared about the environment, right? So that is how he found out that actually Vespa buyers don't really care about the environment. So I'm going to leave it up. I'm going to give this up for you guys. How am I doing on time, though? I have an hour and...
You have as much as you want.
Okay. The students cringe. But I'm gonna turn it back to you guys, right? And so you've just seen a customer problem sort of set of things to test, basically, and then you've seen some core assumptions that we've laid out. Now I'd like you guys to pull out, let's say, one of your ideas. Maybe you can do it in small groups of 2 or 3 people. Just take out one of your projects that you're working on, whatever you're fundraising for, maybe one of your, probably what you're fundraising for, and identify for me these three things. So who are some potential customer groups? You don't have to pick one just yet. Eventually you will pick one, but as you're going through this process in real startup, right, you're going to brainstorm lots of different customer groups, and you're going to say, well, we could sell battery chargers to university students, but we could also sell them to busy executives and tourists or whatever, right? Tell me about the problem that they're facing, and then what are some core assumptions around this, right? So I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes. Just spend some time putting this together and putting a little tree like this, or upside down T, Tetris thing, if you will, for me, and then we'll look at a couple of the different examples that you guys have come up with. Sound good? All right, let's do it. All right, time's up. So let's find out what some of you guys have put together. Do you guys have some stuff? All right. You have a microphone? That's perfect.
So regarding to my project, I actually want to design t-shirts.
Guys, could we get your attention, please?
Regarding to my project, I actually want to design t-shirts, and my target customers are the young adults who like to fashion and who like to start up a new trends. And I think the problem they are facing is they don't want to be too mainstream, or they don't want to be like everyone wearing the same design style everywhere. And so our core assumption is people who buy our t-shirts because they like their uniqueness of the t-shirts, and because of the limited number of stocks for our t-shirts, and because my project also half of my profits from the sales will be donated to a charity. So I assume that people who likes charity will actually buy the shirts.
Okay, so that's a really interesting one. So nice work. Yeah, I like the fact that you're testing actually whether donating half of your profits to charity will be something that even these people care about, right? That's a good thing to test. And I would say another thing though is you probably also even want to find out whether people are having this problem, right? So people cannot find stuff that a lot of other people don't have, right? And that fits some kind of style that they want. So that's another thing that you'll want to test. So go talk to these hipsters at Artisan or whatever is Artisan is already mainstream, Artisan coffee, but whatever, and then find out are you having trouble finding
hipster
obviously you don't want to call it hipster, but yeah. Yeah, okay, sounds good. All right, what else? You guys have some stuff. All right, awesome.
Our potential customer group is...
You might want to speak up a little bit.
Staff or members of tailors who have student ID. So the...
Challenge.
Okay, the challenge is those who... We can see that nowadays everyone uses Android phone or maybe smartphone away. So my challenge is they run out of battery, they need to charge, this and that. So solution is to have this service of rent a power bank. So per day I'll charge them a fee. Okay, so having that, given that those who participate in this service, they'll have to provide student ID just in case we don't want theft of our product, sort and stuff. So yeah, this would be
okay.
idea.
Core assumptions.
First, they don't own a power bank. They don't need it all the time. And power bank is troublesome. So having it in a renting manner makes it easier.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's good. So the one thing I will mention though is that you included your solution. And at the early stages, you're actually just trying to find out whether people have the problem, right?
Yes.
So what I would do is I would just actually spend time talking to tailor students out there and saying set a minimum success criterion, whatever. Half of them have to say that they have this problem that their phone runs out of charge, right? And that it's a problem that they want to fix. So we did this actually at the Lean Startup Weekend. And it turns out that a lot of students have actually already solved the problem of charging their phones. So that was for us, that was really interesting. So we didn't even go to the solution yet. We found out that actually students weren't probably weren't the right market, and then we had to find another market that had this particular need if we wanted to stay there. Good stuff. Anything else? Anyone on this side of the room? Got a... No? Okay. All right. So that's pretty good. And I think you guys, one of the things I think you guys did really well is looking at your core assumptions. Actually, the core assumptions are one of the hardest things to identify, but they're also the most important thing to identify because that's what you're actually testing. Now, speaking of tests, as you're going through this process, there are 3 types of tests generally that you're going to run. So one is the exploration. Oh wait, I should ask before I get into tests, did you guys have any questions about what we just did? Any questions and thoughts?
I got two questions. One of the question is, how do you know which customer to actually target? Another one, right, is okay. Answer the first question first.
Sure. Sure. So for me, this is like one of the beautiful things about Lean Startup approach. Like, we don't need to know who is the correct customer going out. If you're starting up a company in a very classical way and you're saying, okay, we're going to build a product and so on and so forth, you better know who the customer is for sure. But in this case, we're just putting out rough guesses because we don't know, right? Because our startup is a temporary organization. We're searching for that customer. We're searching for that repeatable business model. And so we're putting out rough guesses, and then we're testing those rough guesses, and then we're finding out which ones are the ones that turn up the best, right? Now I'll give you another example of like someone using this kind of approach. And by the way, this is a really great way of getting rid of this whole question of like whose opinion is more important as you're, between your startup partners or whatever, right? Let's not argue about what's the best course of action. Let's just test out what's the best course of action. And this is a lot of what Google does. So do you guys know this guy called Tim Ferriss? 4-Hour Work Week. And then he wrote this book called The 4-Hour Body and 4-Hour Cooking or whatever else. Anyway, he wrote this book called The 4-Hour Work Week, but he had a big argument with his publisher about what it should be called. And so his publisher said, oh, it should be called the like 10 steps to blah, blah, blah. And then Tim Ferriss was like, no, I think it should be called The 4-Hour Work Week. And so they could have made it a huge argument, but what he did is he actually decided he would set up 2 identical landing pages before this is even before he had finished writing the book. He set up 2 identical landing pages. One would be his book with the publisher's title, and then the other one where you could pre-order the book, and then the other one would be his book with his own title. And then he purchased Google Ads. He literally spent like $50 on Google advertisement and just looked at what were the ads that people click through the most, and from those ads, which are the ones that actually people pre-ordered the book the most from. And it was very clear that the 4-Hour Work Week was the book title that people preferred from that experiment. And that's how they got over that argument, and that's how they used an evidence-based approach to actually figure out what was the best title for the book, rather than it being a series of opinions. So even something as subjective as a book of a title of a book, you can test that. So we're just throwing out rough ideas, and then we're going out and testing them, and we're sort of going out and finding out from people, whether your customer group is students. That's fairly easy. You go find them where they are. Second question.
For my second question, right? How many people you need to actually approach to determine whether the idea is a no or a go?
Right, that's a really good question. So the question is kind of like, how do you set, so I have 1 out of 20 or like 10 out of 20 people need to say that they need this thing. Like, how do you set that validation number? And the answer is 2 ways to answer this. So one is, it's entirely up to you guys. It's based on what you are comfortable with and thinking, and how big your startup, how big you want your startup to be, right? So if you want your startup to be a Facebook, you need to have a very, very high validation number on a very large market, right? So like, if it's like 99 out of 100 people say that they want this thing or whatever, or they bought it. Now, if you are going for narrower markets, you need to validate using fewer. You need to go and talk to fewer people, right? So if you're really talking about senior executives in finance in Kuala Lumpur, maybe you only need to talk to 15 people, right? And go and find them while they're smoking at the bottom of their buildings or whatever it is. But if you have a much wider market, like in your case, I think you would want to define your market even more narrowly. But if it's a wide market, then you want to be able to have you need to go talk to more people basically, and you need to set a higher validation number around it. Does that help answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
All right, great. So in terms of tests, there are 3 different types of tests that you will generally run as part of this whole process. So exploration is sort of going far and wide, is doing customer interviews, and is finding out where their pain points are. So these are the things that's like, hey, this really hurts me, and I've tried to solve it, and I haven't been able to solve it, or maybe I've solved it, but in a way that isn't that great. You can pitch them your product or your service, right? So in your case, if you're doing your battery rental service, right, you can go in, and even if you don't have a battery rental service, you can say, hey, would you sign up for this, right? Like those guys did with Puppy Match. And then the third thing, and very interesting thing, is called concierge. And so the idea behind concierge is that you actually deliver whatever the solution is, but you do it with as little technology as possible. So again, in every case, what we're doing is, remember, we skipped that code part, right, in the development cycle. So we're skipping the coding part and the building part as much as possible until we have absolutely, ascertained that this is really the market that is interested in our product. So in every case, we're actually getting data before we actually build now, or almost every case. And you want to organize your tests in a sort of series of levels of increasing difficulty, right? So an exploration test, you're just finding out whether people have that problem. A sort of a pitch, or you're pre-selling something to someone, something that you don't yet have. What you're doing there is you're measuring the demand. Like, do people actually want it? And again, this is very different for market research, because we're not saying, hey, does this kind of interest you, right? We're saying, hey, will you buy this for $19.99 right now? Or will you sign up your dog for a play date tomorrow? Concierge is where you start to actually deliver the product, and what you're testing there is whether the person gets value out of it and whether they will come back to you later, right? And finally, your prototype and your MVP is where you're actually really starting to make it repeatable and scalable. So exploration, I think we don't really need to go a lot into depth about that. I think it's really important, though. We see a lot of people kind of mess up on their segmentation. So a lot of people create very broad segments for what they're looking at in terms of their potential customers, and you actually want to create very narrow segments, and you want to find out, is this particular group of people going to be interested or not, because you want people that you know how to target very easily. And if you have a very vague segment, like people from 18 to 24 in Klang Valley, that is too wide for you to actually target. And you want to also understand how deep the pain is for them, right? So if they're like, yeah, my phone runs out of battery at the end of the day, but I'm with my friends usually at the time and I don't really need to message them, then they don't need this solution, right? And so you need to understand how have they tried to solve this problem before? Have they paid money to do it? So on and so forth. Now, once you are done figuring out what it is that is the problem, you've validated your customer and your problem set, then you go into your solution, and then you start testing out your solution. And what you want to do is you want to validate what customers are saying that they're going to do with tests that show that they're actually going to do that. And so the pitch of your product is a really good way of doing that. And what you're doing, by the way, is you're not testing your product, you're not testing your marketing messaging, but you're testing your business model. So you're testing ideas around whether or not this whole business works. From, are people going to be willing to rent power banks from me, or do they want to buy power banks? Are stores willing to stock my power banks if I'm planning on selling them through my stores, right? These are all different pieces of how you, remember what a business model is about delivering the value to the customer and capturing the money, right? And so in order for me to deliver value to a customer, it has to go through my sales channel, right? So however, am I selling it online? Am I selling it through PayPal, and actually Malaysians can't use it, and whatever else, right? So it could be all sorts of things like that you're testing, but you're not testing your product or the features of your product or your marketing messaging. So your product pitch is just basically a promise of the value proposition in exchange for some kind of currency. And in this case, as we're doing these tests, you can find that there are all sorts of different product pitches that you can prepare, and some of them are really basic. So at the Lean Startup Weekend, we had people just walking around with sheets of paper with diagrams and saying, one of the ideas for a service was a service where you would get regular health tests from your hair, right? So like someone would walk around in the LRT station and be like, hey, we're running this health testing service, and this is how it works, and you mail the thing, and we will send you back your test results, and it will tell you all of these, whether you have any of these diseases or whatever. And then the call to action at the end, or what's the currency, because you want to extract something from that person to see whether they're really committed to your service. And the currency in that case was to give up a hair, right? But it could be money. It could be an email address like we saw on Puppy Match. It could be lots of different things. So it could be a product pamphlet, whatever. Like, there are a lot of different ways that you can do your pitch. You guys know this already. But I want to say something about online versus offline. So because people do not like to talk to other people for some reason, strangers, our entrepreneurs are afraid of doing this. There's a temptation to try to do this all online, sorry. And the truth is that you cannot do this well online. You actually need to run through the transaction with people offline. So think about the Puppy Match example. If those guys hadn't asked follow-up questions like, hey, are you having any other problems with your dogs or things that you might want to do with them? And then people say, oh yeah, play dates, right? They wouldn't have discovered that piece of information if they had tried to do it online. You want to run this transaction entirely offline and understand how people think and look at it before you start automating it and before you start putting it online. So here are some different currencies that you can trade for your pitch, right? Obviously, you can go out and ask people for cash. That's a very high level of commitment, though. And you might not yet, unless you have some pretty good marketing materials and stuff like that, you might not actually be necessarily able to do it. Although we have seen some cases where they have. So we ran a Lean Startup weekend with one university where one group of students decided that they would create a midnight printing service. And so the idea is that how many of you guys finish your reports at 8 a.m. when they're due at 9:30 in the morning, right? Now there's a problem. The printing shop opens at that particular university. It opens at 10 o'clock, right? And so basically, if you finish your report at 8 a.m., where are you going to print it? Or you finish it at midnight, where are you going to print it, right? And so this group of students said, you know what, we have a nice color printer. We will turn this into a company, a little startup in our university. And so they went around to other students and they said, we will pre-sell credit for using our midnight or 24-hour printing service. We will pre-sell credit for it, and we will, and then you guys can use it, right? And so they literally walked away in the course of an afternoon with $300 in cash, basically, from different students who were interested in using this service. So these university students managed to do that. So you can do that. You can do a cash commitment. Referral reputation in some cases can be more valuable than cash. If I'm in a company and I'm saying, hey, I'll take this to my CEO, that actually could be worth more than cash. In terms of currencies that have medium value, so you get people to give up personal information, business cards, so on and so forth, and then low value is email addresses. Obviously, the higher the commitment that you can get from someone, the more you know that they really want your thing badly. These are a couple of things that can happen during or sort of after your validation, right? So one is you've met the success criterion. That's great. So, more than 10 out of 20 people or whatever it was said that yes. The second thing that can happen is you might not hit your success criterion, but you might get what we call a signal. And so the idea behind a signal is that there are some people who actually, in my target group, were very interested in something else. So Puppy Match, the signal was play dates, right? They got a signal and they're like, hey, we should explore this thing. The third thing is the customers that are foaming at the mouth, right? This is actually the single most important thing that you can go for as a startup or an entrepreneur. It's better to have 5 customers that are foaming at the mouth and that are saying, I really, really need this tomorrow or today, than to have 100 customers that are like, yeah, that's kind of interesting, right? It's way, way better as a startup to do that. And then the fourth thing is that you might have failed, but then at least you've learned something, right? And you've learned it really quickly. So we have a specific definition for what foaming at the mouth means. It's a customer who has the problem. They're aware that they have the problem. They've searched for a solution. They've tried to hack a solution. They've paid for a solution, right? And then these are like the Cookie Monster guys, and they will eat up whatever you give them. But yeah, these are the customers that you're looking for. As you're going to them and talking to them, you know, and you're finding customers maybe that aren't that interested in what you're doing, ask them follow-up questions. Sort of, you know, what's stopping you from adopting this product? Try to find out, you know, are they hesitant? Is there like, you know, posture like closed to you? Try to find out like what is exactly the issue. And you could also elicit questions about neighboring problems, right? So maybe they don't have this problem about play dates, or maybe they don't have this problem about dating other dog owners, but maybe they have another problem around that. So the last, I'm going to run you guys through an example of a board, and I'll run you through an example of a board in action. But the last sort of test is a concierge test. And this is where we actually deliver the value for the product or the service. Have any of you guys heard of this company called Aardvark? So Aardvark was bought by Google for, I think, about 200 million. And it is an opinion search engine. So the idea is if you want to find out what is the best Android phone, you could type it into Aardvark, and Aardvark would spit out an answer based on what, you know, what is generally thought. Now, the guys at Aardvark were planning on building a very complex algorithm, basically, that would be able to spit out answers to these kinds of questions. It would be a huge technology project. But they were like, wait a minute, we don't know yet what kinds of questions people are going to ask yet. So why don't we just set this thing up and we allow people to answer the questions. There are real people behind all of the answers. And then we're going to find, and we spend time finding out what are people asking. And so that's just what they did. They set up a website and people could ask questions, opinion questions, and it was an opinion search engine. It was just that it wasn't a machine answering the questions. There were people behind it. And their plan was that once they would be able to find certain patterns and regularity, then it would start building the algorithm to automate that whole process. And so that's how concierge works, right? Instead of building the piece of technology, and instead of trying to deliver the solution, and in this case the solution that the person is looking for is an opinion, using technology, deliver it using as little building as you can, and then be really flexible about it. City Pockets is another example. Have you guys heard of MAGIC? Malaysian Global Innovation and Creativity Center? Cheryl Yeo? No. So Cheryl Yeo is a Malaysian entrepreneur from Silicon Valley. She sold her company to, well, she was based in Silicon Valley, I should say. She sold her company to Walmart, and she was actually offered to head up Google X, their wearables division at Google X. But she's actually come back to Malaysia to work on building the entrepreneurship ecosystem. Now, this is one of her first startups. It was called City Pockets, and it was like an aggregator for vouchers from different deal sites like Groupon and all these other daily deal sites when there were lots of them. And it looks like it's a service that tracks all of this information, and it actually does track all of the expiry dates for your vouchers. But the thing is that Cheryl was doing it manually in the back end at the early days. And she and her partner set a success criterion. And they said, you know what, beyond a certain number of hours that you spend dealing with voucher management on this site, once you hit that number, we'll build the feature to do it automatically, right? And so they were just building the site as demand was showing that, and as the business model was getting validated. So you can imagine this is like a car, and then there's like someone who's like pushing this wheel, and they're like, okay, looks like enough people care about this car, so let's build a wheel, and then, you know, let's build these other different parts, and now, okay, now we need a rear view mirror because people are asking us for that, you know, and so and so they minimized their risk that way by taking a concierge approach, building it with as little technology as possible, and then setting a success criterion and saying, hey, once we hit a number of hours, or once we hit a certain number of users, let's automate this function. So let me ask you guys this. For the projects that you just did, what would your concierge look like? Just quickly, like, thoughts on what it would look like. You're delivering whatever value your customer was looking for, right? No one has any thoughts? So someone give me, like, what's the value that you guys are delivering for your project? To your customer.
They dread the mic, say no mic, just answer.
Yeah, it's off the record. Just go ahead and answer. Well, okay, so I'll take the example of the power banks, right? So, excuse me. So, you are talking about, like, charging. Effectively, you're talking about charging people's phones, right? So you could have a service where you just have someone who runs around and charges someone's phone. And that would be your concierge, right? So someone could SMS you and say, hey, I'm in LT14 and I need someone to, like, charge my mobile phone. And then you just send someone over with a power bank and then that would be it, right? So that could be your concierge. And then eventually, there's no point in building a website for it yet, right? But then when a certain, when, like, thousands of requests start coming in and it's like, oh, they cannot manage this by SMS anymore, then you start automating certain pieces of it, right? Okay, so let's go through an example of what a validation board would look like, just to close this off, as you're going through the startup process. Now, this is an example for a startup called How's the UX? And UX stands, do you guys know what UX stands for? User experience. So it's a field in interaction design where people look at, like, what's the experience of using this website, or what's the experience of using this mobile app, and, like, do people find it confusing? Are they able to, like, use the different features and functions? So the idea is this is a platform where people would be able to come in, like startups would basically be able to come in and get opinions on how to improve the user experience of their product. And then people on the other side would be able to provide for that. So I'm going to run you guys through an example. And we're going to start with, well, the customer group here that this entrepreneur started with is they said, we're going to talk about bootstrap startup founders. So these are startup founders who haven't received a lot of investment, who do not necessarily have the ability to hire their own UX experts in-house. And the problem that they're facing is that they can't find or hire UX experts, user experience experts. So this is the thing that we're testing for. The core assumption that we're going to look into is, are they having trouble finding and paying for these UX experts? The type of test that this person ran, that this entrepreneur ran, is she ran an exploration test. So she did customer interviews. She talked to 10 startup founders, bootstrap startup founders, and it turns out that 6 of them said yes. Sounds good, right? So we put that core assumption in the validated pile. And then what we do is we test our next riskiest core assumption, right? So are they willing to pay for this UX expertise? And so this time her test was a pitch. So she pitches the service to them. She'll say, hey, I've got this service, and for $19.95, we'll send you one email with an opinion on your UX design. So her success criterion in this case was 80% sign up that she was looking for. And she got that. So she pitched to a bunch of these guys, and 80% of them did actually sign up for. Great. Now, this is going to be a two-sided, what we call a two-sided market. So eBay, for example, is a two-sided market because you need buyers and sellers to come together, right? And it's, by the way, two-sided markets are really hard to put together because it's so chicken and egg. So anyway, who's going to actually provide this UX expertise? Well, in her case, she needs to go find out whether the other side of the market is willing to use her product or her service. So she sets up another column as well. So her customer group in this case would be UX experts with 5 to 10 years of experience. So that's who she's targeting as potentially the people who would supply into this platform. And the problem that they're looking for, she thought, was that they might be looking for some extra income from doing UX consulting. All right. So her core assumption, her riskiest core assumption that she wanted to verify was that they would be willing to do this kind of consultation virtually online. And she ran a test, and the test was a pitch, whether they would consult virtually, and she was looking for an 80% sign up as a criterion for that as well. Now, she has a very narrowly defined market, so that is why she has set a very high success criterion. So she's looking for UX experts with 5 to 10 years of experience. This is not a very big space. It's a very niche market. Turns out that she pitched it to a bunch of UX experts with 5 to 10 years experience, and they were not interested. Okay, so good thing she didn't build a whole project based around that. So what do you do now? What should she do now? Anything. You can say anything. Go and light this whole thing on fire. You know, what should she do now? Sorry? That's a great one. Have you done this before? Okay. So what you're going to do is when a customer problem or customer problem solution set fails, that's what you do a pivot, right? And so the idea behind a pivot is you change one of these things, or you could change multiple of them as well. But in this case, she decided that she's not going to go for, because these people with 5 to 10 years of experience were saying, this would have been great if, when I graduated, because I was looking for, leads in new business, and I was having so much trouble finding them. So she's like, okay, let's go for UX experts with 1 to 5 years of experience. And their problem is they want more experience in leads. So it's not really about the income, quick income. That was really the important thing. So it's the entirely same test. She tested it. She's still 80% sign up, and it worked. So that's great. So basically, she validated both sides of her market. And that's what a validation board would look like. You would keep doing this until you would hit the customer problem solution set that is validated and that people are showing interest in, or you keep pivoting. And the key thing though is you want to do it as quickly as possible. So in this case, the real measure of, and this quote, by the way, you recognize, the real measure of success is the number of experiments that can be crowded into 24 hours. But this is not a quote from Silicon Valley circa 2012. This is something that Thomas Edison said. And so this is how you want to think about your startup. You really want to be able to fail fast so that you can succeed sooner, and run as many different experiments around finding out what is that scalable and repeatable business model. Because your startup is just a search process. It's a search process looking for the right customer, the right product, the right solution, and doing so before you run out of money. So that's it from me. My contact info is up here. And thanks a lot for your time.